Right, so here we go. All right, so welcome everyone to the ATD Central Florida November webinar. And today we are here with Keith Keating, and he will be talking to us about what CFOs think about L&D and how to leverage the CFO as part of your L&D process in your role. And we'll talk a little bit more about some of the outcomes and objectives for today's session. But first, I wanted to say a big thank you to all our wonderful volunteers. We are a crazy group. We have a lot of fun. On the call today is Anita, who is our past president and in charge of ATD certifications, such as the CPTD and APTD, and the wonderful Elizabeth Castaneda, who volunteers virtually from all the way in Seattle and is our amazing social media director. And I think we'll have a few more people that join from our group, but there's as you can see, there's some open roles. So if you're interested in volunteering, not necessarily having to serve in one of those roles, but lending your talents any way that you think might be useful to the chapter. We are always looking for amazing people to join us and have fun with us. As I mentioned, this is ATD Central Florida, and we promote ATD and all the wonderful stuff that you are able to get as being a member of ATD, specifically when you're a power member. Lots of great webinars and free resources available for you. And then there is the, oops, sorry, went too fast. The CPTD, which I'm actually a CPTD credential holder.
Hey, Rosa, are you sharing your screen?
I thought I was. Okay, thank you for that. Sorry, people. That's what happens when you stop sharing and then start again. Thank you, Keith. So can everyone see the screen now?
Yes.
Okay, great. So the CPTD is the certification offered by ATD, and if you haven't done the capability assessment, I think it's a cool assessment that any learning professional should do, and I've just shared the link with you. Whether you're interested in getting the credential or not, I think it's a good idea for you to check that out and see where you stand within what are considered the capabilities that learning professionals should hold. And then next announcement is Save the State. If you are in the Central Florida area or want to travel down to mix and mingle with us, December 7th, we will be at Sam Sneed's in Orlando. And Elizabeth, I wish you could be here because I know you love the holiday mingle. We are also collecting toys or donations for Children's Home Society, as well as food for Second Harvest. And then our chapter will pass on those donations to those organizations. And we're celebrating Employee Learning Week at the same time. So lots going on, lots of fun food, prizes, and fun. So join us that day if you're able to. And now, without further ado, the reason why we're here today. So the wonderful Dr. Keith Keating is here. He's a longtime supporter of our chapter, sharing his insight on so many different topics over the years with us. And he was actually the 2020 ATDCFL Speaker of the Year for his contributions to the chapter during the pandemic. And today he's going to share how you can move from being at risk to a trusted advisor just by demonstrating the value that what you do in the learning space brings to the organization. Dr. Keith's career spans over 20 years. He's a doctoral graduate from the University of Pennsylvania's Chief Learning Officer program. He's a passionate advocate for the importance of learner centricity while enabling, encouraging, and empowering talent to take control of their future through lifelong learning. He holds 2 master's degrees, and he specializes in designing and executing global, innovative, large-scale talent learning transformations, assembling and leading high-performance teams.
Okay. No one cares. No one cares.
A friend. And somewhat of a mentor to me who I appreciate. So Keith, you've got the mic. Take it away.
Thank you, Rosa. I appreciate it. And thank you all for being here today. So I'm excited to share with you my doctoral research. So I graduated at the University of Pennsylvania's Chief Learning Officer program, which is something I would consider you to, or ask you to consider. Happy to talk about this offline with you. If you're looking to further your own career and your own education, there are 3 or 4 programs that exist across the country that focus on chief learning officer type doctoral programs. And so I'd be happy to share any information with you on that and my experience. So with that, my doctoral research is on chief financial officers. And I really wanted to understand what their beliefs were on the value of learning and development. And I'll explain why in a few minutes. But first, my only goal for today is really to plant some seeds to help you think a little bit differently in terms of your relationship with finance and your relationship with understanding the value of what we actually do. And I know some of you are eating lunch right now, so I do apologize, but this will be interactive. In fact, we're going to start off with the breakout room. It's going to be just a few minutes. And what I would like you to talk about in the breakout room is when you think about talent, what are 3 challenges that organizations are facing today? And it doesn't matter your role, it doesn't matter the size of the organization, the industry, we're all facing a number of similar challenges today. And so I'd like you to spend a few minutes talking about this in your breakout rooms. So what we're going to do is we're going to send you in there. You're going to have 5 to 6 minutes. Make sure you unmute yourself, first of all. Then what I'd like you to do is to pick a spokesperson in the breakout room, because that spokesperson is going to share what your group talked about at a high level when we come back. So you're going to introduce yourself quickly. You're going to share your individual idea on what you think the 3 challenges are, or just one of the challenges. As a group, identify the top 3. We'll bring you back in. Remember who your spokesperson was. Now I'm going to ask the spokesperson to raise their hand, and then we'll talk a little bit about the 3 organizational challenges that we're facing with talent. So with that, Rosa, send them into the breakout rooms for me. Let's do 3 or 4 people per breakout room. So again, identify a spokesperson, talk about 3 challenges. We'll see you in a few minutes.
All right, getting ready to beam them in. All right, looks like everybody's in the rooms.
Perfect. I'll just broadcast the message. Hey, Sanjo. I'm going to assign you to a breakout room. We are talking about the 3 challenges that organizations are facing today. Oh, no, can't even hear.
I can assign
Hey,
him.
Sanjo. Sanjo, welcome. We're going to assign you to a breakout room. We're talking about 3 challenges that organizations are facing today from a talent perspective.
Okay.
So I'm gonna throw you out. There we go. Perfect.
Yep.
So you should get a pop-up message to join that breakout room.
He's in.
Perfect.
which have been about 3 minutes so far.
Hold on.
I'll go ahead and close them. Oh, there we go. All right, great.
Keith, was it by design that you put me and Danny?
I just noticed that you both were in the same. No, I would have mixed you up.
That's okay.
That's funny. No, it was not by design. All right, we've got another 15 seconds for everybody else to join. Sorry, we interrupted your lunch, Danny.
Oh, not a problem.
This meeting is recorded.
All right, welcome back, everyone. So now if you will click the raise hand button and let me know who the spokesperson was. That way I know who to call on. Danny, what did you and your team talk about?
Awesome. So we came up with 4. We hadn't decided on 3. But first, we talked about, do organizations really know their own talent? So a large challenge is knowing what training is needed. Is it a one-size-fits-all approach? Or are you looking to fill gaps and actually customizing for the individuals? Second, we talked about having the ability to answer, what's the return on the investment? Why is this investment in learning important? How will this help the organization? So a large challenge is being able to prove that to those that ask the question, the stakeholders. The largest topic that comes up often as a challenge is timing. So will you allow the time for your employees to invest in their own development? Are you providing opportunities outside of their day-to-day jobs where they're encouraged to do that? And then lastly, we talked about there being so many options available in the open market, so many vendors. How do you prove the vendor that you've chosen is the one to go with, especially when you have so many other folks that have potentially used various vendors. Everyone has opinions. Do they go with just the cheapest option, or they focus on the solution? Having those conversations is certainly a challenge, and trying to figure out what is the best path for learning at your organization.
Yeah, so I agree with all of those. I think your team might have been looking at it a little bit myopically from an L&D perspective, rather than from kind of the angle I was going for was just in general, what are some challenges that our talent is facing today? But I see some similarities, especially with timing, knowing what is actually needed versus what's wanted. Sometimes we don't know the difference between wanted and needed. So, okay, perfect. Thank you for that. Brenda.
Cool. So we came up with many things. One of the themes, training is often seen as an expense, not a generator of value. So I think sometimes that makes it hard for us to really have an impact. Also showing business impact is a challenge, because many times with training, it's more about reactions, and showing true ROI or true value is an afterthought. And as a side note, there's a lot of change right now, and training is not always thought of as an asset to help address that change, because sometimes it's, if the business is going through problems, it's like, well, let's eliminate training because then we'll save some money. And it's a little bit more of a short-sighted view.
Exactly. So we're going to come back to that, whether or not training is the first budget that gets cut. That's something I want to talk about. Thank you for that. John. John, you may be on mute.
Yeah, no, sorry, my internet's a little wonky. So we did take a different approach. We talked a little bit about training or L&D, but we talked a lot about broader implications and what we're facing with talent in general. So we talked about retention being a major issue. The great resignation or whatever we keep changing the name to, and what do we do to keep people in this environment? We talked about the fact that companies seem now to be forcing people back into the office, often full time. We talked a lot about the fact that we had a very really good conversation. We talked about the fact that we seem to have lost sight of fit for purpose solutions. So, we have this one size fits all approach to this day, when all of the research says, the more we can tailor and custom and meet people where they are, the better. We talked about we still haven't made enough inroads in the whole concept of diversity and a diverse pipeline, and being sure we've got the right people and that we're really managing that well and being representative of our population and of the communities where we are. We did mention ROI. We talked about less so about proving the ROI, I think, of what we do, and more about tying what we do to some of these bigger issues. So demonstrating that, people will come to an organization and stay at an organization if they see a career path, right? If they see, and making that connection for the business, that's what we do, and that we're not an afterthought, and Joe from accounting can't come in and do what we do. It's an expertise in a profession. These are things, I think, that are challenges that we face. So that's us in a nutshell. I don't know if that's 3 or not, but again, a really good conversation in the group.
It's 5, but that's okay. So retention, location, one size fits all, diversity challenges, and I really like the ROI. But you specifically said demonstrating the outcome to the business, not necessarily ROI from the traditional standpoint that we think about. Excellent. So I'm going to come back to those in a minute. And last, Tracy, what did your team talk about?
Hi. So I quickly want to validate how you were looking at it, because you said you were looking at it in context of talent. Can you repeat that for me so I can understand, so I can answer in context of the actual question?
Sure. So when you just think about our employees, the talent in organizations, what are 3 challenges that organizations are facing today when it comes to their people?
Okay. So just so you know, we also had a fairly good conversation around ROI as well. So I will not belabor that. That seems to be a general theme. But I think what we're seeing is this, what we have seen over the years is this trend to CFOs are now leading talent or leading HR. And they also are trying to understand what is the impact of what is usually 50% of their liability, of their cost. And so one of the things that we talked about is things like the Great Resignation, but then also this challenge that organizations are talking about in terms of finding people. And I don't think it's that they're finding people, they're finding the right skills. So they're doing a lot of time to interview, a lot of time to onboard, but they may not be identifying what skills the organization actually needs, or that there is a gap between what's out there in the market and what the organization needs. And that, I think, is a risk if you're looking at it from context of the CFO, but then also from context of the people. And then the third thing that we talked about is time to develop the project and time to react to that. So even if you do need to upskill, or you need to make a shift within the talent market, even within your organization, what is the return on that? How do you quickly make that change so that you can start seeing that change and that impact on the organization? So I'm trying to identify things that haven't been addressed as yet.
Those are great additions. And I'm going to come back to the CFOs and their role being more elevated now as leaders. And you talked about Great Resignations, skills, time. So all of these are spot on. Now, I'm very data driven, so I'm going to use some data here to talk about what our research says that are the current top 3 talent challenges or employee challenges. And this is based on research from Gallup, McKinsey, and Burson. And so everyone touched on these, even directly or even indirectly. So 1, employee retention is a huge challenge. Employee engagement and employee skill gaps. So we've got the Great Resignation, or whatever, the Great Retention, or the Great Reset, or the Great something or other. But basically what we're talking about when we're using this phrase is employee retention. And the challenges that we're facing today is in November of 2021, we had the highest number of recorded resignations in history. Now, what's really interesting about that is, so in 2020, we of course saw massive unemployment and massive layoffs and numbers that we haven't seen since the Great Depression. And then we got through 2020, a lot of people lost their jobs, but then something interesting happened that then people just started quitting. They weren't as concerned about keeping that job as they were in the previous year. And so what we've seen is that those number of people resigning have continued to increase. Now it's dropped a little bit since 2021, but it's still above the pre-pandemic levels today. And so it's indicating that it's very indicating that there are some issues that we're having within organizations. And companies are starting to now take notice of this issue in the last year and a half or so. And the reason for this is because of the money associated with it. So in 2020, retention issues, and so what that means is the loss of knowledge, the recruitment time, the time to upskill, having to pay bonuses out or having to pay higher salaries than what you paid previously because someone left. In 2020, it cost $630 billion. In 2021, it was almost $1 trillion of costs associated to organizations because of retention issues or their Great Resignation. Now, on top of that, data is telling us over half of all of those resignations are preventable. If leaders just had the skill set to talk to their employees and understand what it meant to be a satisfied employee, understand what it meant about their own desires in the organization, what they see for their future in the company, half of those may be preventable. And it's just that managers and leaders don't have that skill set that they need. Onboarding. It's a huge issue for employee retention. So the first 3 months of an employee's experience at an organization will determine their lifespan with that company. And so given that onboarding is so often overlooked, we are losing people to retention issues because they had such a bad onboarding experience. And we could improve that if we just put a little time, money, effort into that onboarding experience. And then lastly, research has shown that 94% of employees would stay longer with the employers who helped them learn. That professional development piece is such a critical component, especially starting to evolve in the last few years. So if we look at just these 3 data points, if leaders had the skill set that they needed to be able to lead, communicate with their team, if we had stronger onboarding programs, which is often run by L&D, and point blank, people who have left have said, hey, I would stay longer if my employer would just have invested in me. All 3 of these are related to what we do: talent development, learning and development, training. McKinsey did some research from April 2021 to April 2022 to identify why people were leaving or planned to leave within that time period. The number 1 reason was lack of career development and advancement. Again, a direct relation of what we do every day, developing that talent. Then we've got employee engagement. So we're starting to hear more about that. The phrase has been around for a while, but the reason it's becoming more prominent now is studies have shown that 36%, only 36% of US employees are engaged. That's just a little over a quarter of the workforce are actively engaged, whereas 74% want to leave their company, which means they're either actively looking or they're just simply not engaged. And the result of this is it's costing $350 billion per year. So for every employee that is unengaged, that estimated cost per year for that one individual is $3,400 to $10,000, depending on their role in the organization. So that cost is huge. So we saw 2021, $1 trillion for the Great Resignation. We saw in 2021, 350 billion was lost to unengaged employees. And the reason that unengagement is an issue is that research has also shown that companies that have higher engagement are 21% more profitable. So that's why we care about this. The organization should care about unengagement. And the top 3 reasons why employees are unengaged: they don't feel like there's a culture, they're not connected to a bigger picture in their organization, they don't have the skills, or there's no developmental opportunities, or they're feeling undervalued and underappreciated. All 3 of these, again, link back to what we do. L&D can create and drive the culture. We can help educate our talent on being connected to the bigger picture. We, of course, provide the skills and the developmental opportunities, and we can also provide the coaching and support to leaders and managers to help them understand what our talent needs to feel valued and to feel appreciated. Again, all linking back to what we do. And then third, the skills gap. This has been an issue for a while. This was elevated and evolved quickly with COVID. We were talking about skills gaps more towards 2030. I think we're seeing that now sooner rather than later. But by 2030, it's estimated that we are going to be short 85 million workers in the US. That's going to equate to another $1.75 trillion lost in opportunities. That work may need to go offshore someplace else if we can't get that skill set. Globally, we're looking at over $8 trillion lost just from skill gap issues. So we've got great resignation, we've got turnover, we've got unengaged employees, and we've got these massive skill gaps. So putting all that together, what does that mean? It means that we've got our work cut out for us. It means that we are one of the most important functions within an organization. We've got organizations that talk about their greatest asset. People are our greatest asset. It's a phrase that executives love to share and to say, but then of course you start talking about investment in that asset, and then they start to shake a little bit and sort of change the subject, but they finish it with people are our most important asset. Well, if that were true, they should be investing in workplace learning and development. So again, what does all this mean? That the most important role in the organization is us, because we are the ones that are going to be able to turn the tides and change the retention issue, the engagement issue, and the skills gap, which at the end of the day equates to driving significant value for our organizations. But for the most part, we're the only ones that really understand that and believe that. So as I mentioned at the beginning of the call, my doctoral research was all on CFOs. So let me explain a little bit about why I decided to study CFOs. So I've been in the industry for over 20 some years now. If you're doing the math, I started when I was 5. So again, executives always say, people are the organization's greatest assets. You know, training helps our assets improve business results, and it helps them stay competitive. Training is a critical function for employee growth and retention. However, when the going gets tough, training is cut. So there's this juxtaposition. People are so important. We need people. People need to be trained. They need to be educated. They need to be developed. We know that doing that provides value for the organization, but yet when there's challenges, training gets cut. So for me, I was working at General Motors when I was starting my doctoral work. And in my first year at GM, the project that I worked on, we had a $3 million cost savings. And then we had a $1.5 million increase in sales based on studying the control group and the group that actually went through our training programs for sales training. So we had what we thought was really good ROI. And I was very excited. And so I said, okay, let's take this to the leadership. The first thing that I was told was, don't tell finance. If you tell finance that we had a $3 million cost savings, they're going to reduce our budget by $3 million. If you tell them that we had 1.5 million increase in sales, they're going to expect that every time we run that program, we're going to have 1.5 million increase in sales. So don't tell anybody. You and your team did a great job, but keep it to yourself. And so then I took a step back and I reflected on that and realized that I had never had a relationship with a CFO. The CFO to me is terrifying because the only time they ever talk to me is when they're cutting my job or someone on my team's job, or they're reducing our budget. And so I thought, well, we have such tremendous value, this great value proposition in the organization. Does the CFO understand that? And so that was really my research purpose for studying the CFOs. When I spent a little more time understanding what the role of the CFO is, literature says that the CFO is considered a business partner of all functional departments and interacts with all leaders in the organizational value chain. So what's interesting to me about that is CFO is a business partner of all functional departments. Well, L&D, talent development, is a functional department and interacts with all leaders in the organizational value chain. We have tremendous value or potential value to the organization, but yet nowhere in my career has the CFO ever been a business partner to me or looked at us as part of the value chain. CFO, the budget oversight, measuring and reporting of all activities that support and drive organizational value creation. So what was also interesting to me with this is, so first of all, they're the ones that define the budget for the organization. That I kind of knew. But they're also responsible for reporting on any activities and all activities that support and drive organizational value creation. Yet we don't see L&D talent development in annual reports, in the CFO report. And so that was, again, a juxtaposition that I wanted to explore to figure out why, if the CFO is responsible for that, why are they just not working with us in learning and development? So here's my question to you. In your experience, do you consider the CFO a stakeholder of L&D? So you know who your stakeholders are. So let me rephrase this. Thinking about your stakeholders, do you consider the CFO a stakeholder for you in L&D? If you'll just jump in the chat and let me know yes or no. While people are typing, Rosa, what's your thought? In your experience, do you consider the CFO a stakeholder?
I consider them my number one stakeholder. And thankfully, I've got a good relationship with our CFO. And I start planning our fiscal years, July to June. I start planning around April, gathering all my data, and actually set up meetings with him to discuss why we need either to increase or keep the budget the same. And, you know, and I try to be fiscally responsible and report to them, you know, how things go, and review the quarterly spreadsheets I get and all that, and, you know, bring up any inconsistencies. But I keep the conversation flowing with them, and let them know how money is being used or why it's being used a certain way. And so far, at least here at CareerSource, right, where I've had that opportunity to establish that relationship, it has worked. And we've actually seen increase in our dollars versus decrease in our dollars. Now, if I could just get more people on my team, I'd be super happy.
Excellent. That's a great data point that you don't hear often, resulting in an increase. Cecil, I'm curious about, you said ideally, yes. What does that mean to you?
I'm making a direct comparison between my previous life and what happens day to day currently. My previous life, I used to directly report to a CFO. So pretty much every week, the conversation was around what value I bring to the organization. And so I was, and anything that I did as the head of corporate training division was to satisfy the needs of a CFO. Now here with the current role that I have, I don't even know who my CFO is. So that's the issue. So each time I have to take a decision on certain learning specific investments for the organization, there's a huge conversation that goes to the entire management committee, in which the CFO is also part of. But then I'm never aware as to who the final person who's taking the decision is. So it's a challenge. So I personally feel like, no, ideally the CFO has to be a stakeholder to make those, important decisions from an L&D perspective. But unfortunately, current role that I'm in, that's not the case.
Yeah, and I find that tends to be the case. There's the theory of yes, the CFO should be a
Yeah.
stakeholder, but the reality is a little bit different.
Mm-hmm.
So why the CFO for me? First of all, the evolution of the CFO role has been really tremendous. So if you look back in movies or media, 50s, 60s, 1970s, the CFO was portrayed almost as a nerd. It was typically a white male, would wear glasses. If you think about the phrase pencil pusher or bean counter, that was the vocabulary that was used, which is a bit derogatory. However, in the 90s, that really started to shift when organizations really began to focus on profits. Then they turned to, well, who knows about the profits? Who knows about the value? Who knows about the money? Oh, it's the CFO. And so the CFO's role started to evolve, and eventually they became the second in command. So if you look at org structure, it's typically the CEO president and then the CFO directly under them. And the reason you can tell that that's continued in that path is the CFO is now part of the direct path to CEOs. In fact, currently 25% of CEOs were previously CFOs. CFOs focus on value creations. They're supposedly business partners to all that create value within the organization, and they're on that track to being the CEO. So in my mind, I thought, rather than just focusing on the CEO, let's focus on the next person who's giving information to the CEO and also making these really important decisions when it comes to money and it comes to value. So for me, the importance of this study was there's a lot of, there's a big absence in data around the CFO. So I spent a lot of time researching to see what was out there, and I couldn't really find anything about what CFOs think or value in terms of L&D, talent development. And so I believe that without this type of research, training will continue to be an at-risk function. I wanted to understand more about the CFO budgetary process when it comes to training. But I also wanted to get data for us, L&D, but also for CFOs to help them start to recognize the need to have consistent reporting mechanisms that include human capital investments. It's just slowly starting to creep up in their financial reports, but it's buried deep in there. We're not talking enough about the investments being made in human capital. And as we think about the Great Resignation and the fact that employees today want to know how much is being spent on developing them, CFOs have to start reporting on that information. As a result of this research, I thought that our learning leaders might be able to argue in a more cohesive manner based on data for increased funding that helps to reduce turnover, drive competitive advantage, demonstrate ROI, do everything that we do, and then of course help support and mitigate the issue that we're facing right now with the Great Resignation. So there were 3 research questions that I focused on. The first one was, what beliefs do CFOs have about training in general? So when I talked to CFOs, the question was, well, what do you believe about it? What do you know about it? What was your experience with it? The second was, to what extent are CFOs engaged with the training function from their perspective? It's one thing for me to say I've never had a conversation proactively, but I wanted to know from their perspective, do they consider themselves engaged with us? And then what influences the training budget? I thought that understanding this might help us have a few data points that we can use in those conversations with them when we're talking about increasing or even just maintaining our budget. So I'm going to walk you through some of the findings now. So the first question was, what beliefs do CFOs have about workplace training? But before I share with you what I learned, I want to just open it up to us as L&D practitioners. What are some of the benefits of workplace training? So Cecil, in your mind, what's a benefit that we get from training? Why do we do what we do?
I look at it from 2 angles. One is from a gap analysis perspective. For a specific role, what are the skill sets that one's supposed to have? And if there is a gap, a training could fix that. Another angle that I would see it is gain analysis, as in you are good at what you're doing for the current role, but what next?
Mm-hmm.
How
so
can
skill
you
gaps, development,
Yeah.
future development. Perfect. How about Aisha? Aisha. All right, how about Brenda?
Well, I think there are a lot of benefits to workplace training. I mean, as we talked about engagement, I think career paths are huge and just having that professional development. Yeah, those are the top couple of things that come to mind.
So we know closing skill gaps is a benefit. We know developing employees. We know there's engagement. So without even looking or needing to find research, we know that there are benefits that come from what it is that we do. And here's the thing, CFOs know it as well. So in my research, all CFOs identified that there are benefits that come from L&D. Again, this is not news to us. And I categorized it in 3 areas. 1, learning improves lives of employees. Learning improves the performance of employees. And learning improves organizational performance. So everyone I spoke to, everyone I studied, everyone was part of the research, all identified benefits. Now, these benefits broke down to 3 categories. So helps employees feel valued, helps have a positive impact at home, helps improve decision-making, increase skills and productivity, helps to keep them motivated, helps to drive culture, helps to reduce turnover and increase employee retention, increases organizational commitment. So they came up with all of these benefits on their own. And so it was hard having those conversations because they're so quick to say, yeah, training drives culture. Well, if you have a culture issue, or you've got employees saying they don't feel connected to a culture, wouldn't you look to your L&D group to solve that? Or if you have high turnover rate, if you immediately identify that training improves organizational performance, you're calling out, it reduces turnover and increases employee retention, wouldn't you want to leverage us for that? So they all identified values, which started to feel really good. The top 5 benefits that my research uncovered was the first benefit. Number 1, employee retention and reduces turnover. So it increases employee retention and reduces turnover. So you look at, we have the Great Resignation happening right now. This is happening over here. We're losing tons of people. It's costing us $1 trillion. A separate conversation. What benefit does L&D provide? Oh, it increases employee retention and it reduces turnover. Well, then close the gap. You already have the solution, CFOs. The next was developing talent. So we're losing talent because they don't feel like they have professional development options. Well, L&D, that's the number 2 reason, to value rather. It improves organizational leadership and creates better leaders. It helps employees feel valued, and it increases employee engagement. So the top 3 organizational challenges that exist today: employee retention, employee engagement, and skill gaps. These exist, yet those that drive the budget, those that drive the value proposition and understanding organizations also recognize that we can help solve those 3 challenges. They're just not closing that gap. So what beliefs do CFOs have about training? So almost all CFOs declare that it's an investment. They recognize it's an investment. However, most CFOs indicated training is important and that people are the most important asset, but training's not a priority. So yeah, it's an investment. It's important. People are our most important asset, but it's just not a priority for us. I had some that would say things like, I have so many fires at my feet right now that I can only see what's right in front of me. And training is not one of those important values propositions. And so then I would say, well, what are some of the issues that you're facing? Well, we're losing a lot of money because we can't retain our talent. So wait, that's your priorities. You're losing money, you can't retain talent, but yet 5 minutes ago you identified L&D can solve that for you, but now you're back to saying training was not a priority. Very confusing. The reason for this is that I label it as abstract versus concrete value. So there's this tension that exists between the beliefs of CFOs and their actions. And what I mean by that is they are overlooking the value that we provide to the organization. They know in theory, training increases engagement and the skill gaps, and it can increase employee retention. The problem is none of them could tell me any concrete examples of how that applies in their organization. None of them knew. So everything that they were saying to me was in theory. In theory, we could all say, yes, training does all these great things. And then I would say, well, tell me about it in your organization. Where have you seen the data? How is training impacting or influencing employee retention and skill growth? And no one could answer any of that. And so what we start to uncover there is that, again, they understand the theory, but the practicality is just not there, which means we are not doing a great job communicating to them in a way that they understand. And I'll come back to that in a few minutes. So when I'm talking about training to CFOs, I wanted to know, what do you think, what do I mean by that? When I say training, what comes to your mind? To them, training equals leadership training. The problem with this is leadership training is such a small percentage of what we do. And leadership training is not available to everybody in the organization. It tends to be kept to a small population. And I would say that it is not exclusive, or rather it is exclusive. It's not inclusive. And so we need to be creating opportunities for everyone to upskill and develop. But for them, training equals leadership training. Training also equals finance training or compliance and regulatory, but they're missing the bigger picture of everything that we do, from our hard skills or technical skills and our power skills development. They're just viewing it as a leadership program because that's their experience. The majority of the experience that CFOs have with the concept of training was a leadership program that they went to, which again goes back to us needing to build more of a relationship with them and communicate in a way that they understand what it is that we do. So research question 2, to what extent are CFOs engaged with the training function? And again, this is from their perspective. So my question to you, and a couple of you already answered this, but I'm going to ask it a little bit in a little bit of a different way. Do you have an active relationship with your CFO? So the way that I define active relationship is, do you meet on a reoccurring basis? And do they know who you are? So it could be once a quarter, it could be once a month, whatever that is for you. But I'm just curious, do you have an active relationship with the chief financial officer? If you'll just put in the chat for me, yes or no. And so Rosa, I heard from you that yes, you do have an active relationship. I will say that I don't. It's kind of, I feel a little bit hypocritical, even after doing all this research. I still don't have an active relationship with my CFO, and I need to fix that. Looks like
I think
Margaret.
it's easier for me because we're a small organization. Like I have a total now, we're actually onboarding 3 people today. I just got a message that they're cleared through getting their equipment. So we're small. We have about 315 people now with those 2, right? With the 3 that got onboarding today. So because of that, I think it's easy for me to go knock on Leo's door or send Leo an email or send, hey, is this a good time to meet? So that, I believe, has been the asset. Working in bigger organizations, I got lost in the mix of, we're 1,000 strong or more.
Yep. And John called out, no, often the boss won't allow it, which is something I've experienced too. So John, tell me a little bit about your experience with that.
Yeah, so it's a little, you described something earlier. I forget how you put it, but it really resonated for me. Don't tell finance, right? I've worked for a number of leaders over my career who didn't want to show our cards. We had really good data that would demonstrate value of a program or an approach, and they didn't want to show it. I've had bosses who, that's my relationship, back off. It's this weird, I'm trying not to show my cards on how I feel about reporting into HR. We won't talk about that. It's a mixed bag, but the politics of the C-suite can be a challenge when you're wanting to talk to the CFO. They know who I am, right? And we have the conversation, but to have this kind of, unfortunately, I've not had the luxury of this kind of open door relationship.
Yep, and I've experienced the same. So my hope is, and this deck will be available to you, is that by the end of the session, you have some key data points that you can begin to discuss. And maybe for you, John, it's with your CHRO to help educate them, find out what their relationship is. You know, maybe you can't have, for bureaucracy reasons, that one-to-one with your CFO, but maybe you can help empower your CHRO with some data to have that conversation.
I should say that was my prior position, but I think it's really, it's indicative, I think, of many experiences I've had over the years.
Yeah, same for me. So here's what I found. To what extent are CFOs engaged with the training function? They said, 36% said occasionally. We'll cross paths occasionally. 27% said active. I talk to them on a reoccurring basis. I know who they are. Now, the ones that have the active relationship, they also were supportive of training. They understood a little bit more about the value proposition and learning. I'm not a fan of the word training. So L&D had a seat at the table, if you will, and the CFO was part of that. 27% had no relationship. And what's funny is there was a couple that were just unsure if they had a relationship, which to me means there's no relationship there. If you're not sure if you have a relationship, you're not sure if you're dating somebody, you're not dating them. So this gave me some insight into the fact that there's definitely a mixed bag with how CFOs view the relationship with the training function. So those that have an active relationship, here are some characteristics. Training was part of the executive leadership team. Training is a regularly discussed topic, strategy, goals, and objectives, which is really the ultimate of where we want to get to from a C-suite perspective. And they had an organizational culture that supported training. So it's not just that the CFO decided they were going to have an active relationship, it's that it was part of the culture to do that. A CEO talked to training. Training was part of strategy, was part of goals, was part of objectives. And that culture supported that, which to me, that's rare. That's what we want to get to. But that's what was the characteristics of those that had the relationship with training. And the third question was, what influences the training budget? So for you, would you consider this fact or fiction? The training budget is the first budget to be cut. Fact or fiction? Elizabeth, what would you say?
I think it's probably the second. It's in the top two for sure.
Okay. How about Margaret? Fact or fiction? Training budget is the first budget to be cut.
I'm actually pretty new to the corporate environment, so I'm hoping it's not.
So I spent years with the idea that the training budget was the first budget to be cut. And there's actually literature that in my research that I found, and even dating back in ATD, ASTD years ago, it used to be just, I think it was TD. I found some literature in the 1960s where they talked about training being the first budget to be cut. My opinion is that this is fiction. So as I've gotten more exposure into organizations and moved up into different roles and now have, been part of the C-suite, what I have found personally is that budget cuts tend to be across the board. But the reason that we think we're the first ones to get cut is because that's all that we're viewing is the training budget. So when the training budget gets cut, we take it personal and we feel like it's something that's being done to us, which technically it is, but we may not be aware of what's happening to marketing, what's happening to sales, what's happening to IT and all these other divisions. So this was a question I wanted to explore with the CFOs, and I'm going to come back to that in just a moment. So what I wanted to understand from them was, how do you manage the training budget? What does that look like? And so there are three ways that you can manage a budget. You can have it can be decentralized, which means it's managed at local levels. It can be centralized, which managed at a central function, HR or L&D, or it could be hybrid, a little bit of both. And so what that means is, I'll give you an example. At General Motors, we had 18 different business units. You had engineering, manufacturing, IT, security. Each one of those had their own training budget. So that's a decentralized training budget. Now, what happens when you have a decentralized training budget is that there could potentially be no oversight. So if you asked any executive leader at GM, how much did you spend last year on training your talent? No one could give you an answer. HR could tell you how much they spent on a subset of leadership programs, but that's just one small vertical. Then you have these other 18 business units, and who knows how they're actually managing those budgets. Because what happens then is finance may say, okay, 18 business units, each one of you get $10 million to run your business. Now, when it's managed at a decentralized level, one business unit can say, you know what, I actually don't like L&D. I think the money needs to be spent more on research and on bonuses. So 5% goes to L&D and the rest goes to everything else. Then you have another business unit where they're big fans of L&D and they say, you know what, 20% of our budget should go to training our team members. Internally in an organization, you may have different experiences based on different business units. And so for me, I'm not a fan of 100% decentralized budgets because there is no oversight at that point. And so that's where I think more of a hybrid approach can be beneficial, because in the conversations with the CFOs, the majority of them actually had no idea how much money was spent on upskilling talent. Now they would say, yeah, we invested money, but I gave it to the business units. So, whatever they did with it is what they did with it. So almost half have a decentralized business budget management, then centralized 32%, and then 23% were hybrid. So I have this in there twice, I guess. So do you believe the CFOs target training for budget reduction? So I think that what we're talking about is it may not be a direct focus only on L&D, only on training, and it's a more broad-based approach. And so that was my question to them. Do you have an awareness of the training budget being cut? So 41% said, yes, I do have direct awareness and direct action, but no one said that they ever specifically targeted the training budget. Now, is it possible that they're not telling the truth? Absolutely. There's always that possibility, because some people may not want to say, yes, I target training. What they said was, I would make budget cuts across the board. So like right now, my organization, many of us are going to be in a recession soon. And so the message was 60% budget cuts across the board, every single business unit. So yes, L&D was impacted, but we were not specifically targeted. 36% said they had no awareness of any training budget cut that had ever been done. And 14% said they had indirect awareness, where they might have delegated an action to somebody else, and that person at a local level might have decided to cut the budget. But overall, the CFOs have said, no, we have not specifically targeted L&D or training. So when I think back to the fear that I had, because I've always been a bit fearful of the CFOs and fearful that training is the first budget to be cut. It's not a blanket statement that can be applied across the board, at least from the CFO's perspective. They're saying, yep, we cut budgets, but we cut a lot of budgets, not just targeting L&D. So that felt a little bit better, at least getting some of that data set. So the other piece was, what influences the training budget? And we talked a little bit about this before. So a couple of people were talking about ROI and demonstrating the outcome to the business. The number one influencer for increasing the budget, according to CFOs, is prioritize the business needs. What they said was L&D, in their opinion, tends to identify their own needs and desires and wants. And so they use their budget to that. They have not clearly articulated how what L&D is doing translate back to the overall organizational business priority. So that's what we need to do a better job of, is making sure that what we're focusing on in L&D ties back to business priorities, and then making sure that the CFO is aware of that, that's what we're focused on. So overwhelmingly, they said 60% prioritize what you're doing in L&D to what the business needs. Demonstrate value. If you can demonstrate the value of what you're doing, we're likely to not cut the budget or increase the budget. Here's the caveat with that. The phrase ROI, return on investment, that is a financial calculation that means something different to CFOs, to finance, than it does to us. I believe that we have to move away from ROI in the phrase itself. We can still demonstrate our value. And I'm still going back to my notes. I like, someone said, demonstrating the outcome to the business. So demonstrating outcomes will demonstrate value, but that's a little bit different than ROI if you think about the true calculation of ROI as it stands by itself. CFOs said, you bring us this data, this ROI data, but it's not real ROI data, because we can't use that because it is not 100% verifiable. There are other influencers that could be at play here. I'll give you an example. Let's say at GM, we created a new sales program, and everyone in Texas went through this sales program, or half the people in Texas went through this sales program. Now, when they finished that sales program, the next month, their sales increased. Is that causation or is that correlation? Because what also happened that month is there was a flood. And when floods happen, cars get ruined. And when cars get ruined, people need to go buy more cars. So was it actually our sales training that helped increase the sales, or was it the fact that there was a natural disaster? These are things that we always have to take into consideration when we're thinking about how we're demonstrating our value. And so what the CFOs said, which I found really interesting, they said qualitative data is just as important or even more important than your quantitative data. Tell me the story behind what you're doing and the value that it has. Do not send me an Excel spreadsheet with a bunch of numbers in it, because I don't understand the context. I'm not going to spend time trying to figure it out, and I don't really believe your data anyway. I want to know the story behind what you're doing and how it's impacting the business, how it ties to the business priorities. Tell me about the individuals. And this goes back to the idea of voice of the learner, qualitative research. So for me, voice of the learner is always so much more important than that hard number. When you've got the voice of the learners talking about the way that it's improved their lives and the value that's come from that, that speaks so much more volumes than just sending a little table with some dollar figures, because we need to start demonstrating what we're doing and helping finance and our executives recognize that people are more than just a number. And so when we put their voice behind that, it becomes much more powerful. And then the third reason that they may increase the budget, or there may be an influence there, is the relationship with the CFO. As much as they were saying, for the most part, we don't really have relationships with training, the response was, I don't have time to build a relationship with training. What I want is L&D, is training to build a relationship with me. So in fairness, the CFO doesn't have the time to chase us down. Now, on the flip side, it is in their job description to be a business partner with all value creating functions within the organization. But understandably, training is not a priority then for them right now, because they don't understand the value. We have to help them understand the value, which means we have to build a relationship. So they've said clearly, 3 ways to influence the budget: prioritize the needs to match those of the business and the organization, demonstrate the value to me, and build a relationship with me. So a couple of important points that also came out of this research was there's a lack of equity and nomination process. So I said that when I talked about training and what that means, CFOs said training equals leadership training. Well, leadership training is not an equitable opportunity. Not everybody has access to that. And so a number of CFOs talked about this nomination process. And so they are actually aware that there is an inequity from an L&D perspective within organizations. What was also interesting was 3 of the CFOs I spoke with are CFOs from very big L&D organizations that focus just on L&D. And what's interesting is those were the 3 detractors. Those were the 3 most negative CFOs who didn't believe in investing in their people. And so for me, it was a real disheartening and eye-opening data point, was that the CFOs that support an organization that is delivering L&D to other organizations doesn't recognize the value within their own organization. John.
Yeah, so just to make sure I'm clear, you're saying that L&D is their product or service.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, okay. So they're selling it to everybody else. Okay, interesting. Very interesting. Thank you.
Selling it to everybody else and they don't believe in it.
Wow. Okay.
So it led to a job change for me, because once I had that data point, I realized I just can't work with a company where we're selling something that we don't believe in. In fact, one of the CFOs specifically said, do we even have a chief learning officer? Do we even have a training function within us? I thought I cut that out 2 years ago. Yeah, so that was an interesting data point. What else? Social response bias. So I kind of hinted this earlier. Were the CFOs telling me the truth? I don't know. Social response bias is real. In fact, one participant called it out specifically, and he said, how much are we saying to you because it sounds good? You know, none of us want to say, hey, we don't want to train people. We shouldn't be training people. He was saying, so keep that in mind, that as you're talking to people, there may be the social response bias, which is real. And then there was this whole topic of reporting. So reporting is a double-edged sword for CFOs. Some of them were saying, no one's asking for it, so why am I going to report on human capital data? It's not a requirement yet. When it's a requirement, then I'm going to do it. What was interesting is one person said, why would I report on something I'm ashamed of? And I said, what do you mean by that? He said, well, I don't want to tell people that we're not investing in our most important asset. He said, that's embarrassing. If I ran you the numbers, it would say we're investing $100 per year in the most important asset. So they recognize that there's an issue here with the fact that they're not investing enough, which is why they're not reporting on it, which is why I'm an advocate of forcing them to report on this to be held accountable. Because at the end of the day, we need the CFO, in our corner, and we need to hold them accountable. And one way to do that is through reporting. So some conclusions. 1, CFOs acknowledge employees are an organization's most important asset, and they acknowledge that training can produce benefits. However, CFOs are overlooking the concrete value that results from training. They're not putting it in their reports. They aren't able to articulate what it is that we actually do, the value that we're actually creating. For CFOs to better realize the value, they need clear measurement metrics and reporting processes, because clearly what we're doing, they don't find valuable and meaningful in terms of reporting. So what does work for them? Well, that can only be answered by building a relationship with them and finding out what type of reporting mechanism is valuable for your CFO. As I mentioned, what was an aha moment for me was a number of them said, hey, qualitative data is just as good, if not better. I'd never thought about that. I've always only been giving the raw quantitative data. Talk to your CFOs and find out what's valuable from them, what they would want to see from you to help them understand the value proposition that we're bringing. And the last find is there's just an overwhelming gap for us to bridge the relationship between CFOs and the training function. So what's the overall significance of this several years research? From a CFO's perspective, we need them to build relationship with the training function. We need them to include training as a topic with peers. They need to review the training budget management process. They can't just say, yes, we gave all of our business units $10 million and we let them do what they want to it. They've got to hold the business units accountable for reporting out on how much is being invested in human capital. Then they need to proactively publish this data, but they need to recognize training as a priority. That should be, there's a Y missing, priority. So one thing I'm doing with the CFOs is I'm writing, I've published several articles with this data. I'm speaking at CFO conferences. I'm out there advocating for CFOs to recognize you're talking about these trillion-dollar issues that are happening within organizations with retention, turnover, engagement, skills gaps, but you're not aware that the solution is actually already within your organization. You just need to understand the value that exists there and what it is that we do. From a training perspective, we need to help CFOs recognize training as a priority. We need to proactively build that relationship. Let's not wait for them to come to us, because that will probably never happen unless they're cutting the budgets. We need to go to them proactively. And if we can't get to them, get to whoever's next in line and start building some relationships with someone in finance so that they can be our allies. We need to increase our focus on qualitative data in our storytelling approach. We need to also make sure that we're creating influential and meaningful training experiences. So here's what I mean by that. Several CFOs who were not fans of training is because once early in their career, they had a bad experience. They weren't CFOs yet. They weren't a senior anything, but they remembered that experience for the rest of their career, and it tainted their viewpoint. On the flip side, some of the CFOs that were the strongest allies of us was because they had a meaningful and influential training experience. So it's just a reminder that we need to always treat every single class as a priority to pave the future way of leaders in the organization that may be allies for us. And then, of course, we need to build relationships with leaders across the organization, not just finance, but leaders everywhere, so we can be creating allies and champions. And then even outside of the CFO and the training function, organizational leaders can also be aware of this data because they need to include training as a strategic component. And it's a mechanism to support the combat of the Great Resignation. So again, we know that there's benefits from training. We know that we've got these issues out there. We know that they can be closed or at least minimized with what it is that we do. We just need to help bridge that gap because it's not as obvious to other people as it is to us. Yes, there's retention issues. We can help. People aren't looking at us in that mechanism or that manner because they're not aware that that's value that we can create for them. So we have to be advocates for ourselves and help to make them aware. So one participant said, learning and development should not be living in fear of the CFO. I really don't think CFOs are the enemies of learning and development at all. And I would agree. They just aren't aware. They aren't educated because this is not a priority for them, but we can help make it a priority by helping them understand the value of what we do. Because ultimately, CFOs and us have the same goal. We are working towards creating value for the organization. That's ultimately what we're doing in L&D and talent development. Is yes, we're focusing on upskilling, closing gaps, keeping people engaged, keeping them prepared or skilled for their current job or their future job. But all of that is creating value for the organization. So it's just reframing a little bit what we do in terms of the vocabulary so that it resonates with CFOs, because value is their ultimate focus. And ultimately, that's our focus as well. All right, so let's talk for a few minutes. I'm tired of talking and I want to hear from you. Now what? So I've talked about this data. You're in these positions in your organizations. So now what do we do with this data? Feel free to come off mute, raise your hands. Steve, I'm just going to call on you first, do the first name myself. So now what? What do we do with this? Steve might not be there. How about John? Or is it Noel?
It's Noel.
Noel, sorry.
I think it's very helpful to one is for the learning and development group to really focus efforts on quantitative and qualitative data. The last organization I worked for, we measured net promoter score. We applied that to our learning and development efforts. And we also went out and looked at KPIs of employees and applied our training programs and looked at that again and measured the difference right down to individuals and teams. So I think that's important to do that, because it also helps learning and development, instructional designers, managers, leadership, but it's also then helpful data to pass back through or up the organization to CFOs and to show them that, we're not just developing programs and putting them out there, but we are showing how it's impacting productivity and efficiency for our frontline workers.
And I would build on that, and we'll probably I'll host another session later this year, but I have a book coming out in September called The Trusted Learning Advisor. And in so many cases, we are treated as order takers. And that's how a lot of the organization looks at us because of what we've done historically, where we need to evolve to being trusted advisors. And everything that you just talked about is part of being that trusted advisor, so that we are proactive rather than reactive, so that we have a seat at the table, or we're making our own table and then inviting leaders to our table to understand about what we do and the value of what we do.
Right. And what helped us too is the organization was using net promoter score. And so we looked at, well, what data are they using? What data are they collecting? How are they reporting? And can any of that be used by us, so that we had this common language as well?
Common language is such an important piece of that, especially when it comes to the CFO. We tend to, in L&D, have our own language and vocabulary, and then we try and use that outside. But again, being a trusted advisor means that we are adhering to their language and their vocabulary and their terminology and their data. And that's why we've been measuring for so long our way, but let's find out what's valuable to the CFO and how they're measuring data. And just like you're talking about net promoter score, so that we can align to the organization. We can still keep, if we have a different way we want to do it, we can still keep that for ourselves. But in order for us to get the exposure that we need, we've got to start speaking the language and understanding what the other leaders actually need.
Right.
Danny, I just saw your question in the chat. So I think this was when I was talking about training equals leadership and decentralized budget. And you said, it raises the question regarding equity and inclusiveness in learning opportunities. If it's decentralized or not managed as a whole budget, who's getting the opportunities? That's the underlying issue that we see within a lot of organizations, and why people are saying there's no development opportunities. And leaders are saying, well, yes, there is. No, there's not. There's a development opportunity for some, if you have the relationship, if you can carry the cost. So I'm a big advocate of tuition, not tuition reimbursement, but tuition assistance. So tuition reimbursement is unequitable because you're assuming that the employee can then carry the cost. And not only do they have to carry the cost on their credit card, but then they have to pay the interest rates, because we don't pay them until after they've completed the session and then shown their certificate. So if I pay in January, I take the course through June, I don't get the certificate till July, that's 7 months I've had to carry that cost and that interest rate. Most people can't afford that, at least the ones that we actually need to be upskilling. And so we need to put in practices that create equitable opportunities, like tuition assistance rather than tuition reimbursement. All right, we've got 1 minute left, 2 minutes left. So I want to open it up. Any other thoughts, questions, comments, feedback?
So I did want to share, going back to her question of how do you make it equitable? Again, I'm in a small organization, so it's a little bit easier, but some of the things that I do with like these external learning programs that we send people to is I keep track of who's gone, right? And then who can go next. So for example, conferences that we attend every year that are related to what we do in the industry, if you went last year, you're not going this year. We're going to look and see who hasn't gone at least in 3 years, and then give that opportunity to someone else, so that now we're more inclusive of everyone versus exclusive, same people going all the time. Yes, there could be some that go every year because they really need to for how it relates in their role. But for the most part, each year, if we're sending 40 people to a conference, at least 30 of those people are new people that have never attended before, or it's maybe they haven't gone in 4 or 5 years. And I've gotten the leaders buy-in on that to help make it more inclusive. And we do offer that tuition assistance. Again, we offer both. So if you want to go ahead, get your degree, etc., there's the reimbursement if you want to go that route. But if this is something that's going to help you be a better person here now, improve how you do your job, we will pay for that. We will put the justification in, and then yes, we want to see the certificate, we want to see that you pass, but we don't want you to incur that financial burden. And we do have that support from the CFO, which is what I think is really important, that the company itself has said, we want to invest in our people now because we don't want them to leave.
Excellent. Well, that's great. It's a great and another way of being inclusive,
right,
and giving opportunities to the wider team. Thanks for that.
What
I know,
want to do is also share, encourage everyone. I think you asked a question of what do we do with the data, and we really didn't get any response to that. I think it's really share it with your leaders, share it with your HR team, share it with your CFO and with other L&D peers, because that's how we're really going to get that seat at the table. That's how the CFO is going to understand that what we do is important, not just the CFO, but CEO, COO, all of the C-suite. This is what is then going to help them understand that what we do is important, and why we do need to have that visibility and opportunities to be able to improve organizations as a whole.
Absolutely. All right, with that, I know we are a couple minutes over, so thank you all for spending the afternoon. We will share the deck. This session has been recorded, so in case you missed any of it. And thank you, Rosa, for your support.
Thank you for your support. I really love that you are such a champion and partner for our chapter. I'm going to put the link so you can all connect with Dr. Keith in the chat. We encourage you to do that. And as soon as we edit the recording, we will go ahead and post an email to all of the participants. So you'll get that. And it will also go on our YouTube channel as well. I also recommend that you follow us on all the social, LinkedIn, Facebook, and YouTube. And connect with us so that you stay abreast of opportunities like this with Dr. Keith. And I'm looking forward to that book. So that will be the next session, hopefully, that we get with you, is to talk about that book or whatever else you're working on, which is always so fascinating. So again, everyone, thank you so much for taking your lunchtime to spend it with us. We really appreciate it. And I hope you all have a great rest of your week. Thank you for joining in. Keith, as always, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks.